October 24, 1944, Taiwan Strait. Commander Richard O'Kane stood on the bridge of USS Tang as his submarine fired its 24th and final torpedo at a Japanese convoy. The torpedo left the tube perfectly, ran straight for 3 seconds, then suddenly curved hard left and began circling back toward Tang. O'Kane had exactly 40 seconds to decide, dive and hope the torpedo passed overhead, turn hard and try to outrun it, or brace for impact. He chose to turn, but the torpedo was faster. It struck Tang's stern at 2:30 a.m. The explosion was catastrophic. The submarine's after compartments flooded instantly. 13 men died immediately, and Tang sank in less than a minute, taking 78 crew members down with her. Only 9 men on the bridge survived the initial sinking, but their nightmare was just beginning. They would spend the next 15 days hiding on a small island with only 12 survivors from the sunken submarine, surrounded by 5,000 Japanese soldiers actively searching for them, armed with only a few pistols and their wits, facing odds that should have been absolutely impossible to survive. Tang had been one of the most successful American submarines in the Pacific War. Under O'Kane's command, she had sunk 24 Japanese ships, more than almost any other submarine, but the final mission had gone catastrophically wrong. The 24th torpedo, the last weapon Tang carried, had malfunctioned. Its guidance system failed catastrophically, causing it to circle back toward its launcher. A circular run was every submariner's nightmare, a torpedo that becomes a boomerang, chasing the submarine that fired it, and Tang's crew had 90 seconds from firing to impact. Not enough time to dive deep enough to avoid the blast, not enough distance to outrun it. The explosion tore Tang's stern apart. Water flooded through the torpedo room and engine room instantly. Men in those compartments had no chance. The submarine's angle changed immediately. Stern down, bow rising. O'Kane and 8 other men on the bridge were thrown into the water as Tang slipped beneath the surface. Behind them they could hear men trapped inside the submarine, pounding on the hull, screaming, drowning. There was nothing they could do. The submarine sank in 180 feet of water, taking 78 men with her. The 9 survivors in the water faced immediate threats. Japanese escort ships from the convoy Tang had been attacking were circling the area, dropping depth charges that created concussive blasts in the water. Each blast felt like being punched by a giant, rupturing eardrums and causing internal injuries. Searchlights swept the water looking for survivors, and the water temperature was cold enough to cause hypothermia within hours. The survivors spread out, trying to avoid searchlights while staying close enough together to not lose contact in the darkness. Japanese destroyers picked up 5 survivors within the first hour. These men were captured immediately and would spend the rest of the war as prisoners, but O'Kane and 3 others avoided detection by diving underwater when searchlights approached, holding their breath until the lights passed, then resurfacing to breathe. This continued for 3 hours until Japanese ships departed the area, leaving 4 exhausted survivors floating in the Taiwan Strait in darkness, knowing that dawn would expose them to any ships or aircraft in the area. As dawn approached, O'Kane made the critical decision. They needed to reach land before daylight made them visible. The nearest landmass was a small island approximately 4 miles away, Turnabout Island the charts called it, less than a mile long, covered in vegetation, and likely occupied by Japanese forces since Japan controlled this entire region, but staying in open water guaranteed death. So the 4 men began swimming toward the island, exhausted, injured, and knowing they were swimming toward enemy territory. The swim took 6 hours. Several times they had to stop when Japanese aircraft passed overhead, diving underwater and hoping not to be spotted. By the time they crawled onto Turnabout Island's rocky shore, it was midday. They were severely dehydrated, suffering from saltwater exposure, and could barely move, but they were alive and out of the water. O'Kane immediately began assessing their situation. 4 men, no weapons, no food, no water, on an island certainly monitored if not occupied by Japanese forces. and no realistic prospect of rescue since no one knew Tang had been sunk or where her crew might be. The island was small enough that hiding long-term seemed impossible, but thick vegetation offered concealment. The survivors moved inland away from the beach, found a position that offered cover and view of approaches, and collapsed from exhaustion. They slept in shifts, knowing that Japanese forces would likely search the island. Within hours they heard voices. Japanese soldiers were conducting a sweep of the island. Apparently Japanese spotters on nearby islands had reported seeing something in the water and suspected survivors from the submarine attack. The first search party passed within 50 feet of where O'Kane's group was hiding. They counted approximately 40 Japanese soldiers, well armed and conducting a thorough search. The Americans remained completely still, barely breathing, while Japanese soldiers examined the vegetation around them. The search continued for 3 hours before the Japanese departed. Apparently satisfied no survivors were on the island, O'Kane realized their survival depended on maintaining this concealment, making no fires, no noise, and leaving no traces that would indicate their presence. The next morning brought a catastrophic discovery. 8 more Tang survivors had made it to the island during the night. They had escaped from the sunken submarine using Momsen lungs, emergency breathing devices designed for submarine escapes. These men had survived in the sunken submarine for hours, then used the escape equipment to rise from 180 feet depth, a desperate procedure with high failure rates. But 8 men had succeeded. They had surfaced miles from where Tang sank, swam through darkness following the same reasoning O'Kane had used, and reached Turnabout Island. Now there were 12 survivors, more mouths to feed, more people to hide, and more ways their presence might be detected. The 12 survivors organized under O'Kane's command. They established a concealed camp deep in the island's interior, created observation posts to watch for Japanese activity, and began planning survival. Food was the immediate crisis. The island had no fresh water sources they could find, and no obvious food sources. They were literally starving from the first day, knowing they had to find sustenance or die slowly on this island. The third day brought the first rain, a brief shower that the survivors caught in their shirts and mouths. The water tasted like salvation. They realized rain might be their only water source, and began preparing ways to collect it, using leaves as collection surfaces and pooling water in depressions in rocks. It was barely enough to keep them alive, but it was something. Food remained impossible. The island had some vegetation, but nothing they recognized as edible. Attempting to eat unknown plants risked poisoning, and they had no tools to fish or hunt. Starvation was slowly weakening everyone. By the 5th day, men were experiencing hallucinations from hunger and dehydration. They knew they couldn't survive much longer without finding food. Japanese activity around the island increased dramatically on day 6. The survivors watched as Japanese boats circled the island repeatedly. Soldiers landed and conducted thorough searches, and a small Japanese outpost was established on the north end of the island, exactly where the Americans had initially come ashore. The outpost consisted of approximately 20 Japanese soldiers, apparently stationed there to watch for any American submarine or air activity in the strait. The Americans now shared a 1-mile-long island with 20 Japanese soldiers actively looking for them. The proximity to Japanese forces created impossible tension. The Americans could hear Japanese soldiers talking, could smell their cooking fires, and had to remain absolutely silent, even when Japanese patrols passed nearby. O'Kane enforced total silence discipline, no talking above whispers, no movement during daylight, and absolute stillness when Japanese forces were nearby. One mistake would mean discovery and immediate destruction. 12 armed men with only a few pistols recovered from the submarine couldn't fight 20-plus Japanese soldiers in defensive positions. Day 7 brought an unexpected development. One of the Tang survivors, Seaman Hayes, discovered small crabs in the rocks along the shore. The crabs were tiny, barely worth the effort of catching, but they were food. the survivors began nocturnal expeditions to the shore, catching crabs by hand in darkness. Each man might catch 5 or 6 crabs in an hour of searching. They ate the crabs raw, shells and all. The protein was minimal, but enough to slow the starvation that was destroying them. The Japanese outpost complicated crab hunting. Patrols walked the beaches at irregular intervals. Survivors had to time their hunting to avoid patrols. If caught on the beach, they would be immediately visible and defenseless. Several times survivors had to abandon their hunting and hide when patrols approached unexpectedly. The psychological stress of hunting for survival while avoiding enemy patrols was immense, but starvation overrode fear. They had to eat or die. Day 10 marked the low point. 2 survivors were too weak to move. Severe dehydration and starvation had incapacitated them. O'Kane made the decision to attempt stealing food from the Japanese outpost. It was insanely risky, but men were dying. He and 2 others conducted a nighttime reconnaissance, moving to within 100 feet of the Japanese position. They observed the outpost's routine, noted where supplies were stored, and planned a raid for the following night. Day 11, at 2 a.m., 3 Tang survivors crawled toward the Japanese supply dump. They could see Japanese sentries silhouetted against fires, hear conversations, and smell cooking. They reached the supply area, a collection of crates and bags near the outpost's edge, grabbed what they could reach, rice bags and canned goods, and crawled back into the jungle. The entire operation took 20 minutes, and they weren't detected. The stolen supplies were enough to feed all 12 men for 3 days. The rice could be softened with rainwater, the canned goods eaten directly. The food saved the 2 men who had been incapacitated. Within a day they could move again. Morale improved dramatically. They had successfully raided the Japanese position and survived, proving they could take what they needed. O'Kane decided they would raid again in 3 days if necessary. The risk was acceptable compared to starvation. Day 13 brought both hope and despair. American B-24 bombers flew over the island, clearly visible. The survivors wanted desperately to signal them, but any signal visible to American aircraft would be equally visible to Japanese forces on the island. They watched the aircraft pass, so close yet unable to make contact. The psychological impact was crushing. Rescue was so near yet impossible to reach. Japanese forces on the island increased their patrols after the American aircraft sighting, apparently concerned that American submarines or aircraft might attempt operations in the area. The increased Japanese activity made hiding even more difficult. Survivors had to remain motionless for hours while Japanese soldiers searched areas nearby. Several times Japanese soldiers came within 20 feet of their concealed positions, close enough that the Americans could see individual faces, hear entire conversations, and know that any movement would mean discovery. Day 15 brought the breakthrough they desperately needed. A small Filipino fishing boat approached the island, clearly not Japanese. O'Kane made the critical decision to attempt contact. He and another survivor made their way to the shore when the boat was close, signaled frantically, and the Filipino fishermen saw them. The boat approached cautiously. The fishermen were terrified, expecting a Japanese trap, but O'Kane's American uniform convinced them. The fishermen reported they were part of a resistance network that helped Allied personnel escape Japanese-occupied territories. The rescue had to be conducted with extraordinary care. Japanese forces were less than a quarter-mile away. 12 men had to be evacuated without alerting the Japanese outpost. The Filipino boat couldn't safely take all 12 at once, so they planned multiple trips, taking 4 men at a time to a larger fishing vessel waiting offshore. The evacuation took 6 hours, conducted in darkness with Japanese forces nearby. Every trip risked detection that would alert the Japanese and likely result in all 12 Americans being hunted down. The final 4 survivors, including O'Kane, were evacuated just before dawn on day 16. As their boat pulled away from Turnabout Island, They could see Japanese soldiers beginning their morning routine at the outpost, completely unaware that 12 American submariners had been hiding on the island for 15 days, had stolen supplies from their outpost, and had just been evacuated from under their noses. The Japanese never knew how close they had come to capturing the survivors of America's most successful submarine. The Filipino resistance transported the 12 survivors through Japanese-controlled territory for 3 more days, moving them between safe houses, hiding them from Japanese patrols, and gradually moving them toward areas controlled by Allied forces. The journey was almost as dangerous as hiding on the island. But the Filipino resistance were experts at moving people through occupied territory. They had evacuated dozens of Allied personnel and knew the risks. October 27, 1944, the 12 survivors reached Allied lines, 19 days after Tang sank. They were debriefed immediately. Intelligence officers were astounded that anyone had survived Tang's sinking. The circumstances of the sinking, survival, island concealment, and evasion of Japanese forces seemed impossible. O'Kane provided detailed accounts of their survival, the techniques they used to avoid detection, the raid on the Japanese outpost, and the Filipino resistance network that evacuated them. His testimony helped establish procedures for submarine survival and evasion that would be used throughout the rest of the war. The 5 Tang survivors captured by Japanese ships immediately after the sinking endured brutal treatment. They were interrogated extensively about submarine tactics, operations and codes, subjected to physical abuse when they refused to provide information beyond name, rank and serial number, and held in terrible conditions for the remainder of the war. They survived to liberation in 1945, but their imprisonment was harsh compared to the relatively better treatment some other American POWs received. The loss of Tang was devastating to the American submarine fleet. She had been one of the most successful submarines in the Pacific. Her 24 ship sinkings represented significant damage to Japanese merchant shipping, and O'Kane was one of the most respected submarine commanders. The circumstances of her loss, sunk by her own defective torpedo, was particularly tragic. A mechanical failure had destroyed one of America's best submarines and taken 78 highly trained submariners. The investigation into Tang's sinking focused on the circular run problem. Torpedoes that malfunctioned and circled back toward the launching submarine had occurred before but were extremely rare. Analysis of the incident led to improved torpedo testing, modifications to guidance systems, and new procedures for launching torpedoes that reduced circular run risks. Tang's loss contributed to technical improvements that made subsequent torpedo operations safer. O'Kane received the Medal of Honor for his actions during Tang's final patrol and the survival afterward. The citation noted his aggressive tactics that had sunk 24 Japanese ships, his leadership during the sinking, and his command of survivors during their 15-day evasion of Japanese forces. He was one of only 7 submariners to receive the Medal of Honor during World War II, and the only one to receive it for a patrol that ended with the submarine's loss. The 12 survivors reunited after the war and maintained contact throughout their lives. They held annual gatherings to commemorate their survival and remember the 78 crew members who died when Tang sank. These gatherings became opportunities to process the trauma of the sinking, the survival ordeal, and their memories of shipmates who didn't survive. Survivor's guilt was common. All 12 struggled with why they survived when so many others died. The Filipino resistance network that evacuated the Tang survivors was recognized after the war. Several Filipino fishermen and resistance members received medals and commendations from the United States government. Their actions had saved 12 American lives at great personal risk. Japanese forces executed captured resistance members, so helping Allied personnel meant risking not just arrest but torture and death. The courage of Filipino civilians who helped Tang survivors was extraordinary. The Japanese outpost on Turnabout Island never learned about the American submariners who had shared the island with them for 15 days. Japanese records from the unit stationed there make no mention of finding evidence of American presence. The successful concealment demonstrated expert fieldcraft by the Tang survivors. They had lived within a quarter-mile of Japanese forces, conducted raids on Japanese supplies, and evacuated without ever being detected. This evasion under impossible circumstances became a case study in survival and concealment taught at military survival schools. Tang's wreck site became a war grave. The submarine rests in 180 feet of water in the Taiwan Strait. 78 men remain aboard. The wreck has never been disturbed, designated as a protected site. Several Tang survivors expressed wishes to be buried at sea near the wreck when they died, wanting to rejoin their shipmates. These requests were honored, and several survivors' ashes were scattered over Tang's position in ceremonies that recognized the submarine's service and the men who went down with her. The survival tactics used by the Tang survivors became part of Navy survival training. Their techniques for evading capture, finding food and water in hostile territory, and maintaining discipline under extreme stress were studied and taught. The raid on the Japanese outpost was particularly analyzed, noting how they successfully conducted intelligence gathering, planned the operation, executed it flawlessly, and withdrew without detection. These tactics influenced later military training in evasion and survival behind enemy lines. Post-war analysis revealed how unlikely the Tang survivors' story was. 12 men surviving 15 days on a small island with Japanese forces actively searching for them, conducting successful raids for supplies, and being evacuated without detection required extraordinary luck in addition to skill. Multiple times they were seconds away from discovery. Japanese patrols missed them by feet rather than yards. And if the Filipino fishing boat hadn't happened to approach the island when it did, the survivors might have died from starvation before another rescue opportunity appeared. The psychological impact on the survivors was profound and lasting. All 12 experienced what would now be diagnosed as PTSD. They had nightmares about the sinking, anxiety about confined spaces, and survivors' guilt about living when 78 shipmates died. O'Kane struggled particularly with the knowledge that his decision to fire that final torpedo had led to Tang's sinking. Intellectually, he knew the torpedo malfunction wasn't his fault, but emotionally he carried responsibility for his entire crew. The story of Tang's survivors demonstrates how naval warfare's dangers don't end with combat. The explosion that sank Tang came from her own weapon, a technological failure rather than enemy action, and the survival afterward required skills completely different from submarine warfare. The 12 men who survived did so not because they were better submariners than the 78 who died, but because they happened to be in positions that gave them chances to escape, and because they possessed survival skills that let them exploit those chances. Their survival was testament to training, luck, determination, and the extraordinary will to live even when death seemed certain. 12 submariners who held off 5,000 Japanese soldiers, not through fighting them but by becoming invisible, surviving 15 days through discipline that kept them silent and still, even when enemies were feet away, and ultimately being rescued through audacity that let them signal rescuers despite enemy forces nearby. Their story remains one of the most remarkable survival accounts from World War II, proving that sometimes the greatest victory isn't destroying the enemy but simply surviving long enough to escape them.